Let me extend another word of welcome to each one of you. It's really an honor and a privilege to gather God's people together in God's house and worship the Lord together. As we begin this morning, will you join me in prayer? Almighty and loving God, we praise you for who you are. Now, having heard your word, through the reading of your word, through the singing of your word, through the proclamation of your word, may the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable to you. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. There is a chain of gyms throughout the Southeast known as Planet Fitness, which I'm only assuming is where astronaut Reggie goes to lift weights when he goes to work out. But Planet Fitness is known for two main things. One, that it's pretty cheap. $10 a month is all it costs to join the gym at Planet Fitness. But perhaps more than that, they're known as the Judgment-Free Zone. This is actually their tagline for their logo. Now, how a gym can police judgment, I haven't figured that out yet, but they try pretty hard to make it work. They have an alarm. And if you go into a Planet Fitness and they catch you judging somebody, they pull the alarm. It's called the lunk alarm, L-U-N-K. I guess that just is another way of saying somebody who judges. I'm not entirely sure. But really what has to happen is somebody has to tell on you. You know, if they see you looking at, oh, that person's not lifting heavy enough weights, then they'll go and they'll pull the lunk alarm as it's to keep away this sort of judgment. But my question for Planet Fitness and for us today, I suppose, is, isn't it impossible not to judge? Don't we as human beings judge each other all the time? Particularly perhaps in a gym setting where the guy who's lifting a whole bunch of weights looks down on somebody who's not lifting as heavy of weights. But we do this all the time in our interactions with others. We make judgments about people. So I think today as we look at these words of Jesus, where Jesus tells us not to judge, we need to be pretty clear about what Jesus means when he says, do not judge. So first, I think it might be helpful to talk about what Jesus does not mean. And by doing that, I'm hoping that we can get to a working definition of what Jesus means when he says, do not judge. So first of all, Jesus does not mean judgment in a legal sense. Right? We as a society have determined that if you murder, if you steal from somebody else, if you take somebody's life, there's going to be punishment. Actions have consequences. And you actually go before a judge, sometimes a jury, that will tell you the actions that you did, your actions are going to get you into trouble. I don't think Jesus is telling us don't judge in a legal type of sense, because societies throughout the world have always determined there are certain rules that we're all going to live by as a society. And if you break those, you're going to have to suffer the consequences, because actions always have consequences. I also don't think that Jesus is referring to judgment in the eternal sense of the word judgment. Certainly, Jesus has eternity in mind throughout his ministry, but that's for Jesus to judge. Jesus dies for us on the cross, is raised from the dead, and ascends to be with the Father, where he sits at the right hand of God the Father as judge. This judging relationship is for Jesus. Christ himself is the judge. And so I don't think Jesus would tell us not to judge each other in an eternal sense, because that would have just been understood, because he would have understood himself as the only person that can judge. So I find it odd. And this is one of the struggles that we have as a society. We're quick to tell other people, well, the things that you're doing are going to pronounce eternal judgment upon yourself. We go that way. We make it negative, and you hardly ever see somebody protesting somewhere that says, holding up a sign, right? What you're doing is going to make you go to heaven. It's always the other way around. What you're doing is going to send you to eternal judgment, eternal hell. But I don't think Jesus has this kind of judgment in mind, because for himself, he would have seen himself as the sole judge. I think more of what Jesus has in mind is a definition that we can look at here that tells us, don't judge each other in a way that you form an opinion about someone without having love for the other person. The absence of love. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, says it this way. To think of another person in a manner that's contrary to love is to judge somebody. So we see right away there's an aspect of love that comes before this judgment. Now, this type of judgment, we can happen, and I think perhaps at least two ways. And it happens first like this. We just we see somebody and we judge who they are. We say, rich or poor, fat or skinny, tall or short. We make these kind of judgments almost right away. And part of that is human nature. We like to put people in categories. It makes us easier to say that one person is a certain way. We just rush to make these judgments. And it happened this week. You might have seen this news story. There was a representative from Arizona who showed up at a protest for tighter immigration reform. So he shows up at the border to be at this protest, and a school bus pulls up. And he stops the speech that he was making, runs up to the school bus, and says, we have to stop these people from coming in across the border. He even sends, we have a picture, I think, of the Washington Post reported this story. And so this was the scene in the school bus that he saw. And so he stops his speech, runs up to the school bus, sees the kids that were in the bus, and says, we have to stop these sort of things from happening, people coming by the busload into our country. And he even sends out a tweet. I don't know how he had time to do this in the midst of this, but this actually happened. There's a bus coming in. This is not compassion. This is the abrogation of the rule of law. And so he sends this out, and a couple hours later, a reporter followed up on the bus and comes back to Klansman and says, that bus that you judged, that you said were immigrants, it was a bunch of kids going to the YMCA camp. He rushed to make a judgment. It was because he saw a school bus passing through without taking the time to even think about, well, maybe this is not a bus full of immigrants trying to get in, but it is, in fact, a bus full of kids that are going to the YMCA camp. But we do this, don't we? We see something, and right away we make that instant type of judgment about who somebody is, about who they are, like a school bus full of kids like this guy did. But I think perhaps a deeper level than that, the second level of judging, is that when we judge somebody's actions, something that somebody actually has done. So if you're paying close attention to what I've just been saying, what I just did is I judged Klansman for his actions. This is the second level of judging. When somebody does something and we say, oh, they shouldn't have done that, they judged. I might take a pause here and it's impossible to preach a sermon about judgment. You might not have ever heard a sermon about judgment. I don't know that I have. This might be the first one I've ever heard myself. Because who wants to stand up and say, don't judge? Because I'm the chief judger, all right? So Jesus says, you hypocrite. Let me just say today, guilty. I'm a hypocrite. I judge people all the time. I don't love people the way that I should. I get angry. I do things that I know are contrary to the will of God. So I hope you don't hear me as somebody who has this whole judging thing figured out, because I sure don't. But you hear me coming from a place of, I'm a hypocrite. I want to wrestle with this together. As the community of faith, let's be in this thing together. Let's help each other determine what's a right kind of judgment so that we can best be the people that God is calling us to be. I hope you hear me coming from this perspective and not as a place of judgment. But so we do. This is the kind of judgment, I think, that makes it hard, because I can judge Klansman because I don't know him. I don't love him or any stretch of whatever we consider to be love or judgment. It's easy to judge the people that we don't love. So how then do we go about cultivating a spirit of love? How do we go about taking the plank out of our own eye, as Jesus tells us? It involves a lot of inner self-awareness. It involves a lot of inner work. It involves a lot of, almost like I just did, it involves us admitting that we're not perfect. It involves us admitting that we're a sinner before God. It involves us first taking a good hard look at our own actions. If we're not first looking at ourselves, we have no right to proclaim judgment on anybody else. Jesus tells a wonderful parable that illustrates this perfectly. Because what happens is we puff ourselves up with pride. And we say, well, I'm better than you because I would never do that. That's a prideful way. And I think what Jesus is calling us to do is to be on our knees before God, humbly admitting that we don't have it all figured out. Jesus told this parable to certain people who had convinced themselves that they were righteous. Right? This is what we do. We convince ourselves that we're the righteous. That's what judgment means, is we're righteous, you're not, so I can judge you. And who looked down on everyone else with disgust. Two people went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself with these words: God, I thank you that I'm not like everyone else. Crooks, evildoers, adulterers, clansmen, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of everything that I receive. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He wouldn't even lift his eyes to look toward heaven. Rather, he struck his chest and said, God, show mercy to me, a sinner. I tell you, this person went down to his house justified rather than the Pharisee. Because it's all who lift themselves up that will be brought low. And those who make themselves low will be lifted up. It's a pretty powerful parable. Because the Pharisee was the religious elite. The Pharisee was somebody who had all the religious rules figured out. The Pharisee, as he claims about himself, was somebody who got it right by appearances. The Pharisee gave a tenth of all that he earned. The Pharisee fasted. The Pharisee prayed. But he puffed himself up with pride. So much so that he looks down on the tax collector, who by outward appearances was the sinner. The outward appearances didn't even deserve to be in the temple that day, but the tax collector is the one that Jesus says is lifted up. Because the tax collector, in an act of humility, bows down before God and says, have mercy on me, a sinner. The first step in loving, the first step in not judging one another is to bow down, face down before God. Not puffing ourselves up with pride and comparing ourselves to others, but saying instead, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. It requires a great deal of humility in order to do that. But God is calling us not to a position of pride so that we can judge others, but to a place of humility where we can acknowledge that we're all hypocrites, where we can acknowledge that we're all sinful before God. The second step to loving is to figuring out what exactly does it mean to love one another. Now, this, for me, is a trap because it's real quick, and you've probably heard people say this to you, I love you, but... And whatever you're doing, they can say, it's an excuse for them to call you out for whatever it is that you're doing. I love you, but stop doing that, right? This happens all the time. And so I'm not talking about the kind of love that just gives you a blanket excuse to call somebody out for something that they're doing wrong. But I'm talking about the kind of love that's cultivated over years and years and years and years. And I really think there's a place in Christian community for us to be able to hold each other accountable. I believe there's a place in Christian community where we should be able to say to our brothers and sisters, look, I really, truly love you. And we need to grow together to move in a different direction in the life that you're living. But it takes years and years and years of cultivating the relationship. Yesterday, I was officiating the wedding of my cousin outdoors. And yes, it rained just as much in Rutherford County as it rained here yesterday. But I was talking to my cousin before the wedding. And they had been together for 10 years. Nobody ever thought they were going to get married. They were just going to live together for the rest of their lives, happy as they could be. And so I was asking my cousin, why, after 10 years, did you decide to get married? And he said, I never thought I would get married. I was always the kind of person that was so independent that I didn't want to be hitched to somebody else for the rest of my life. And he said, but I got to a point where I loved her so much that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. And the only way to symbolize that was to get married. Sometimes, church, it takes 10 years, decades of loving somebody in order to get to a place where the relationship has grown enough where you can say, I love you. But it has to come from a true place of love, not from a place of judgment. And don't even begin to say that to somebody else unless you've first done that inner work of removing the plank from your own eye. Here at Faithbridge, we try and live this out in a serious way. I hope that when you came in today, you felt like you were welcome. I hope that when you came in today, you felt like this was a place where you could belong. And I really and sincerely hope that when you walked through the door, what you felt was an honest, loving relationship and not a place of judgment. Because we, as a church, really want to be the judgment-free zone where you're free to come and worship God however you are, wherever you're coming from. We want to be that kind of church. One way we're trying to live that out here at Faithbridge is by trying to love our food pantry clients that are here throughout the week. And so one initiative that we're doing is we're starting a Wednesday noon service. And the centerpiece of that Wednesday service is love. And out of that love comes the Eucharist, comes Holy Communion. And so every Wednesday at noon, we're going to pray together, or we're going to have communion together. Because what I really believe about communion, what I really believe about the table of Christ, is that the table is the ultimate judgment-free zone. Christ invites all to his table, regardless of where you're coming from, regardless of who you are. When we're sharing the meal of Christ together, honoring the work of Christ on the cross, remembering what Christ has done for us, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It doesn't matter if you're fat or skinny or ugly or pretty. We're all coming together as children of God, partaking the body and the blood of Christ to celebrate what God is doing in us and amongst us and through us as a community of faith. So I invite you to come on Wednesday at noon. It's informal, and we want you to be there to celebrate with us this meal together as a family, as a community, so that we can love each other better and not judge each other, because we all have planks in our own eye. And so today, what I want us to do, I think it's only fitting if we're talking about this inner work, if we're talking about how can I first come before God and say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. I want to take just a few minutes and allow you a chance to do that. I want to give you a chance before God to say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And you can do that right where you are. You can do that here at the prayer rails that we have. If you would like somebody to pray with you, I'll be more than happy to do that. But I want to take just a few minutes. And as the band comes and leads us in a few minutes of personal reflection time, what inner work do you need to do? What is God calling you? In an act of humility, how is God calling you to humble yourself enough where you can say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner? You might come to mind as you're praying, as you're reflecting, as you're meditating over this. God might bring to mind some places in your life where you need to let go of some judgment. God might bring to mind to you some places where you can love people better than you are currently. But let it start with the work of saying, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Let us pray. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, a hypocrite.